Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving into what is, hands down, the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. We're going to unpack a truly wild dual narrative here. We'll be contrasting two incredibly different groups of people connected by these ancient texts. On one side, you have the chaotic, deeply flawed modern scholars who piece the fragments together. And on the exact opposite side, the highly disciplined, fiercely pure ancient sect who wrote them. It's a fascinating story of human imperfection colliding with historical preservation.
Okay, let's kick things off with a pretty staggering number, $2.80. That was the literal going rate per square centimeter negotiated with Bedouin middlemen to purchase fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls. You see, when these caves were first discovered, the local Bedouins almost always beat the archaeologists to the sites. So to save these priceless pieces of history, scholars had to beg, borrow, and basically raise funds by any means necessary just to buy their own history back, piece by agonizing piece, at a flat rate of $2.80 a square centimeter.
Now, if you have a picture in your head of careful, sterile, modern science, go ahead and throw that right out the window. Just look at this. Here is Polish priest and scholar Józef Milik, who was actually known at the time as the fastest man with a fragment, working on these texts. Notice the cigarette just dangling from his mouth? The ashes are practically falling right onto 2,000-year-old, totally precious scroll fragments. The early conservation of these texts was, well, shockingly loose and careless compared to how we do things today.
Assembling the scrollery team at the 1950s Rockefeller Museum. So, to actually understand the translation of these scrolls, we've got to look at the crew assembled to do the job. The mammoth task of organizing thousands of fragments fell to an archaeologist named Roland de Vaux. He recruited an initial team of just 7 scholars. But there was a massive political catch here. They were working in East Jerusalem, which was under Jordanian control at the time. Due to political pressure, absolutely no Israeli or Jewish scholars were allowed to study their own heritage at first. Instead, the team was made up of brilliant yet wildly varied international academics. You had paleography expert Frank Moore-Cross, the fast-working Józef Milik, an erratic linguist named John Strugnall, and a highly controversial scholar named John Allegro.
Section 2. Brilliant minds, flawed men. The chaos of the translation. You see, the story of the scrolls was heavily filtered through the very real human flaws of these scholars. Roland de Vaux, a Catholic priest, faced a lot of criticism for interpreting the Qumran settlement through his own personal bias, basically labeling it a monastery. And remember that cigarette? While Milik and the team were so incredibly reckless, they literally used everyday Scotch tape to stick fragile, ancient fragments together. It was an absolute conservation nightmare that took years to undo. Then there was John Strugnall. He was a brilliant linguist who ultimately became the editor of the Scrolls Project, but he battled severe alcoholism and manic depression. His erratic behavior eventually led to a deeply controversial interview that caused his total downfall from the team and from Harvard University. Though it is worth noting, his defenders point out he was actually the one who finally brought Jewish and Israeli scholars onto the team later on.
And if you want a taste of the intense internal drama going on in the scrollery, just listen to this. This is a direct quote from scholar Frank Moore-Cross talking about his own colleague, John Allegro. Cross called him one of the few amoral people I've ever met in my life. Ouch, right? Allegro was a scholar who would allegedly borrow scroll material from others and just publish it without permission. He wrote these highly sensationalized, practically unreadable books trying to cash in on the scroll's fame, and sadly, eventually died in disgrace. So here's the absolute kicker, the unbelievable irony between the two groups of people tied to these texts. On one side, you've got the 1950s scholars, a group of chain-smoking, competitive, occasionally amoral, and deeply erratic academics holding humanity's greatest treasure together with Scotch tape. And on the other side, you have the people who actually wrote them, the ancient Essenes, a community entirely obsessed with moral perfection, intense discipline, and absolute unwavering ritual purity.
Section 3. Meet the Essene community. Purity in the desert.
Let's rewind a bit and look at how the Essenes actually evolved. They grew out of the Hasidim, or the Pious Ones, a movement that kicked off around 160 BC. They were extremely strict Orthodox Jews who genuinely believed the Messiah's arrival was being hindered by the corruption of the priests and rulers over in Jerusalem. So to avoid that pollution, they literally packed up and physically separated themselves from society, moving out into the harsh Judean wilderness to live in completely isolated communities. They saw themselves as priestly apocalyptics. They studied, they lived righteously, and they eagerly awaited a massive final cosmic war between what they called the sons of light and the sons of darkness.
According to the ancient historian Josephus, there were about 4,000 Essenes scattered across Judea, and their daily life? It was rigorous, literally self-appointed poverty. They pooled everything they had into one common treasury. We're talking shared quarters, shared clothing, and partaking in deeply sacred communal meals. For them, ritual purity was everything. In fact, at the Qumran settlement alone, archaeologists have dug up 10 mikvehs, or ritual baths, that just highlights exactly how central constant cleansing was to their everyday existence.
Section 4. Echoes in the Wilderness. Blind spots in history.
But here's the thing. Even a community that is absolutely obsessed with purity can totally miss the big picture playing out right in their own backyard. A major question people often ask is, why aren't the Essenes mentioned in the Gospels, and did they ever interact with Jesus? Well, the historical consensus is that they likely knew of figures like John the Baptist, who operated out in the same wilderness. But they completely missed Jesus. Why? Because their expectations utterly blinded them. They were apocalyptic priests waiting for a militant, conquering warrior to lead the sons of light to a fiery victory. A rabbi from Nazareth, preaching peace, love, and ultimately dying on a cross, that just did not fit their rigid apocalyptic criteria, not even close.
Now, to add just a touch of surprising humor to all these rigid beliefs, Josephus actually mentions an Essene quarter over in Jerusalem, located near something called the Essene Gate. The reason this gate existed is frankly amazing. The Essenes viewed the city of Jerusalem as so incredibly sacred that they flat out refused to use the restroom anywhere inside the city walls. They were terrified they would pollute the holy ground. So as a result, you ended up with what we could basically call the Essene bathroom run. Pious Essenes living inside the city would literally have to hold it, rush out through the Essene Gate on Mount Zion, and run all the way down into the Hinnom Valley to a very specific place called Beit Sol, just to relieve themselves. I mean, it is a stunning and admittedly slightly comical testament to just how incredibly far they were willing to go to maintain their impossibly high standards of ritual purity. To wrap up today's explainer, I want to leave you with a rather provocative thought. The Essenes were zealots with profound, world-altering blind spots, and the 1950s scholars who uncovered their life's work, they were erratic, biased, and chaotic. So if our history is written by flawed zealots and then translated centuries later by flawed scholars, how fragile is the truth we inherit? It's a pretty powerful reminder that archaeology isn't just about the cool objects we find. It's really about the beautifully imperfect humans who leave them behind, and the equally imperfect humans trying to make sense of them. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the history you inherit.